If you think about all the places that you like to visit, like a cafe, restaurant, or local bar, there's probably a few of them that are your go-tos, places that will call you a regular. We have many reasons why we go and remain faithful to these places. But have you ever wondered why a place like your favorite cafe feels like home, while others just feel like another coffee shop? That gap rarely has anything to do with design, color palettes, or any other surface level stuff that most branding focuses on. And has everything to do with identity. Specifically, whether a business actually knows what it is, or whether it's just performing what it thinks it's supposed to look like. When most businesses start out, they often start in the wrong place when considering how to establish their brand. It's not as simple as just a logo, design, or tagline. Those things matter, but there's something more fundamental that needs to come first. At its most basic level, branding is the answer to one question. What do people believe about you when you're not in the room? Not what you say about yourself, not what your website claims, what people actually believe based on every interaction they've had with you, your content, communication style, how you handle problems, what you talk about, and what you don't talk about. All that together forms a picture in someone's mind. That picture is your brand, whether you designed it intentionally or not. If we think about this from a psychological standpoint, we can consider the concept of identity formation, which is the idea that psychological stability requires coherence. This means that the inside of what we present needs to match the outside, that who we believe we are and how others actually experience us needs to be reasonably connected for a stable identity to exist. When those two things are misaligned, when we believe one thing about ourselves and people experience something different, we get something else called identity confusion. It's a kind of instability that makes it hard to act consistently or project genuine confidence. The gap between this disconnect, between what we say we are and what people actually experience, is the branding problem. And it's almost never solved by anything like better designs alone. It's solved by doing the harder work of figuring out exactly what's true about ourselves first. When thinking about why this gap is so common, another concept called identity foreclosure comes to mind. This one comes from a psychologist named James Marcia, who was building on this from older work. The basic idea is, foreclosure happens when someone adopts an identity that was assigned to them. And this happens because it's often much easier to accept what was given than to do the hard work of exploring who we are and what we stand for. In human psychology, this usually shows up in our teenage years. Like when someone becomes what their parents expect, what their community needs, or whatever is the path of least resistance, all without ever sitting down and asking whether those identities actually fit. They foreclose on what was pushed on them before ever having a chance of exploring exactly what they could be. In business, it looks something like this. A small business owner looks around at their industry to see what successful competitors look like, the language they use, the promises they make, and the aesthetics that they've built. And without really thinking about it, they construct something that resembles all of that. The same general positioning, the same kind of language, and the same implied promises. Not because any of it is specifically true to what they do or who they are, but because it looks like what a business in their space is supposed to look like. From a human perspective, I actually lived a version of this myself for years. When I first moved to Japan in 2010, I was handed a role before I fully understood what I was walking into. I was the fun, foreign teacher, the guy that entertained everyone and made English feel approachable by being a little goofy. And I eventually got really good at it because it wasn't something that I hated in the beginning. I foreclosed on that identity, not because I decided it was who I was, but because it was all I was expected to be. And I was so good at it that even questioning it started to feel unnecessary. That was who I was, that was what I did, and that was my lane. Now, the problem with foreclosed identities, whether in people or in business, is that they tend to be stable right until the moment that they aren't. They only hold together as long as the conditions that produce them stay the same. But the moment that something changes, the whole thing suddenly becomes uncomfortable and visible as performance rather than something real. For me, that change came in August 2022, when my wife told me that she was pregnant with our first child. Even though I was genuinely excited at the time, something else also manifested that was harder to name at the time. It was a very specific type of accountability. I remember thinking to myself, there's no way I can raise a child to define her own worth if I'm still letting other people define my own. I couldn't keep performing a version of myself that someone else had written and call that something worth modeling for her. and that was when I made a decision to kill that identity. When I look back at that decision, I learned about something called cognitive dissonance. This one was by Leon Festinger in the 50s, which states that psychological discomfort arises when our actions and self-concept are not aligned. When what we're doing and what we believe about ourselves don't match, there's a tension that builds which our minds desperately want resolved. Businesses feel this too, with different language attached. It shows up as inconsistent messaging across different platforms, as an uncomfortable pause when someone asks, what makes us different from others, and we can't quite find that answer. It shows up as marketing that feels fake and forced, even to the people producing it, because on some level, they know they're describing something that isn't really true. The change model from my own personal experience, the moment when a foreclosed identity stops holding, that discomfort is actually the most valuable thing that can happen to a brand, because it's the first genuinely honest moment. It's the moment where the gap between what we say we are and what we actually are becomes impossible to ignore. And that moment, as uncomfortable as it is where real branding work can finally begin. In my case, when I finally stopped performing and started building something on my own, the first thing I had to do was an honest inventory. Not really about my skills, but about something much more fundamental than that. I had to do an inventory of what was actually true about me that couldn't be replicated anywhere else. What combination of experience, perspective, and capability that was in me that others didn't have in my field. What I eventually came up with was something interesting. That all of my previous experiences as an educator, performer, and promoter was the most unique thing about me in a field full of brilliant people. It wasn't a liability that I needed to overcome to be taken seriously in technology. If anything, it only made it easier for me to experiment with new ideas and explain it to people in simple terms. I realized I had been running from the exact thing that was making me genuinely different. And the moment I stopped running from it and started building something on top of it instead, was when what I was building started to feel like it was actually mine. Not a performance of what a tech founder is supposed to look like, but something created from skills that were available to me from actual experience. Going deeper, this fits a concept from Donald Winnicott, who spent a lot of time considering the concept of self. According to him, there's a difference between what he called the true self, the authentic core of who someone actually is, and the false self, the performed version made to meet external expectations and social demands. His argument was that genuine psychological health requires building a life from the true self outward. That even though the false self can have function and be effective in certain contexts, it still costs something to maintain for long periods of time. Ultimately, things built from the true self have a certain strength that the false self can never replicate. The answer to this question is harder than it seems. Most people's first answer is actually their foreclosed identity talking, the industry standard safe version, the one that sounds like everyone else in their space because it was borrowed from that same space. The real answer usually requires sitting with the question longer than what is comfortable. It often involves something that you've been taking for granted because it comes so naturally to you that you've stopped seeing it as something special. Something within the overlap between your background, specific experience, and the way you approach problems that doesn't exist the same way anywhere else. That answer, whatever it is for you specifically, is your brand. Not your logo, not your tagline, but that. We're in a moment in society where surface level branding has never been easier to make. Anyone with a decent budget and some time can make content, build a good looking website, maintain a social media presence, and look like a legitimate operation. The tools are accessible, the templates are everywhere, and the barrier to looking professional has basically vanished. What that ultimately means is that looking legitimate has also stopped being unique. If everyone can look polished, then polish stops being a signal. If everyone can produce content, then content volume stops being the signal. Surface level branding has become a bare minimum rather than a competitive advantage, and a lot of businesses haven't caught up to that reality yet. They're still focused on that surface level, while the thing that actually creates trust operates in a completely different area. What cuts through now is a more specific approach, a genuinely distinct point of view from experience that no one else can replicate. No one else has lived exactly how we've lived and built exactly what we've built. That's not a design brief, that's a question of identity. A question that has to be answered honestly before any surface level work can actually become anything meaningful. So to bring it back to the beginning, What's the difference between your favorite cafe and the coffee shop down the street? Why does one business feel immediately trustworthy while others feel forgettable, even when they're in the same industry, offering the same thing at roughly the same price? It's not design, budget, longevity, followers, or content calendars. It's whether the people running it have done the work of figuring out what's genuinely true about them and then had the courage to lead with that instead of going with what they think they're supposed to look like. Work like that is much harder than simply picking a color design. It requires sitting with uncomfortable questions long enough to get past foreclosed answers and get to the real ones underneath. It requires being willing to look like something specific rather than something safe. And it compounds over time in a way that surface level branding never will, because it's built from something real. The most trustworthy brands aren't the ones with the best designs. They're the ones where you can tell that the people behind them already know who they are.